Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Chris Boomsma, CEO here at the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology. It's my privilege to kick off today's event, to welcome you to this webinar, and to talk a little bit about CAST before I hand it off to our experts who are going to talk more about integrated management of fire-adapted invasive plants that change wildfire regimes. So, a little bit about CAST. We're over 50 years old, starting in 1972. We provide credible, unbiased, science based information about food and agriculture to policymakers, the media, the private sector, and the public. A few facts about us: we are a US based organization, although we are internationally connected. We are a 501c3 membership supported nonprofit composed of both organizational and individual level memberships. What's unique about CAST is we span all the agricultural science domain, working in animal, food, and plant as we try to educate and inform the policymaking community and other audiences. We are nonpartisan, we're science focused, and everything we provide is free to all. You can find our materials on our website. I mentioned a moment ago our mission, and that is to convene and coordinate networks of experts to assemble, interpret, and communicate credible, unbiased, science-based information to the variety of audiences you see on the screen at this time. The key word there early on in that mission is experts. You're going to hear from experts today, and it's those experts that bring tremendous value to the work of CAST. Now, a little bit of a breakdown of CAST and all the experts and volunteers we work with. We have a board of directors, 3 work groups, as I mentioned before, animal, food, and plant, and a strategic advisory council. We have many individuals that are working on papers, whether they're reviewers or authors. We have folks contributing to webinars, podcasts, and more. If you're interested in being a volunteer with us, certainly reach out. You can see where our volunteers come from: academia, nonprofits, government, and companies. So we span all of the major sectors working across agricultural science and technology. Now, just a moment ago, I mentioned to you the Strategic Advisory Council at CAST. That group is specifically working on charting the path for building and becoming the National Academy of Agriculture here at CAST. So, a little bit future focused, but I do think it's worth mentioning to you right now. Why are we doing this? Because agriculture faces rapid technological change, rising geopolitical competition, shifting consumer expectations, and an evolving food and national security landscape. And it's the opinion of CAST that the U.S. needs strong, coordinated, cross-sector leadership in ag science and technology. So we're exploring that. Yet at the same time, our mission continues. And that mission is why we think CAST is a good fit for this future role. If you would like to get more involved with CAST, please take a look by scanning that QR code on the screen at this time. You can learn more about membership and other opportunities that come with membership. And not only that, but being involved in CAST. You can be part of our educational products, whether suggesting topics, being a contributor or reviewer, or helping us host events. You can be part of our newsletter, our social media work, our networking opportunities, our student programs, and overall support. We love partnering with our volunteers, and we hope you'll get involved as well. If you'd like to learn more about CAST in general, do indeed scan the QR code on the screen. If you'd like to reach out to me, take note on the right-hand side of the screen. There's my office number, my mobile number, my email, and certainly, please feel free to reach out via LinkedIn and connect. And now I would like to introduce today's moderator for the webinar. That individual is Greg Dahl. Greg serves as CAST representative for the Western Society of Weed Science. He's a former president of the Weed Science Society of America and currently serves as director of adjuvant education for the Council of Producers and Distributors of Agrotechnology. Greg is also one of the co-chairs of the publication we're releasing today and has been instrumental in bringing this work from concept to the page from which you will read. With that, Greg, welcome to today's webinar. Please take it from here, sir.
Good morning. Well, good morning or good afternoon. Thanks for tuning in. I am very excited to visit with you about this project and everything involved with it. And I've been a weed scientist for a long time, and this has been a very interesting topic to work on. Okay, next slide. There we go. So the idea behind this paper, I attended a Western Society of Weed Science meeting in 2022, and the group there, led by Matt Baur, put on a symposium called Weeds and Wildfires in the West, and it was really, really interesting. And so then I visited with Matt, and then we visited with some of the other authors, decided that we needed to put this together as a cast issue paper. And then over the past several years, we have been doing that, writing it, reviewing it, and bringing it to you today. And so I hope you enjoy this topic. And I think it's really critically important, and encourage you to do whatever you can to help us out. Next slide. So as president of, oops, one back. Oh, come on back. There we go. As president of the Weed Science Society during this project, I was also a member of all of the regional weed science societies, and they are all doing incredible work. The Weed Science Society does have an invasive species committee, as does the Western, and as does some of the other regional societies. And I think that we need to do much more work in this area, and we'll go to the next slide. So these are issues that I've identified over the time. Our problems with weed science is weeds are taking over, and we just don't have enough time, people, or resources. Coming from the area of weed science that I come from, I thought the biggest issue was herbicide-resistant weeds, and I have become convinced that, in fact, invasive weeds may, in fact, be a much bigger issue, and we certainly need all the help we can get. And then the other area that I think is important is using new and alternative technologies for weed control. Next slide. So some of the activities that we've done in the process of putting this together, we participated with the North American Invasive Species Management Association at their annual meeting in November of 2025. And Matt and several people spoke at that meeting, getting the word out. And then we had a discussion section at the 2026 Western Society of Weed Science meeting in March. And so we've been talking about this issue along the way, and now we've got it actually published and out for your looking at it and reviewing it, and helping us out with the issue. So okay, and this is from the NASMA meeting in November. We've got several people that were involved, authors and whatnot, spreading the word about invasive species and fires. And then in next slide, in March, we had a discussion section at the Western Society of Weed Science. And then one more picture or slide. Oh, I'm sorry. So back in July, Matt actually was the Meet the Expert for CAST and made a nice presentation on IPM. Matt is the director of the Western IPM Center, and I'll let him talk more and more about what he does there. And then our other speaker, next slide, is Brian Mealor. And Brian is a professor of weed science at the University of Wyoming. His specialty is weed management and rangeland reforestation and restoration, I'm sorry. And he's also the director of the Institute for Managing Invasive Grasses, Invading Natural Ecosystems, Imagine, which is doing wonderful work. And he's also the interim dean of research and the director of the Wyoming Agricultural Experiment Station. And so I'm going to turn the program over to Matt.
Thanks, Greg. Right. So as Greg mentioned, my name's Matt Baur. I work at the Western Integrated Pest Management Center. We are a USDA, National Institute of Food and Agriculture funded center, regional center, and we focus primarily on getting to the state of being where we have a healthier West with fewer pests. And the way we try and do that is by promoting smart, safe, and sustainable pest management, which could also be called integrated pest management or integrated weed management. It goes by a variety of monikers. So the center has several signature programs, one of which is a signature program headed up by Kasim Al-Khatib, and it focuses on invasive species. And what that signature program seeks to do is to assemble both folks in the, sorry about that. Seeks to assemble folks from both the public and private sectors that span the national, regional, state, and local levels, and to coordinate responses. By doing so, coordinate responses to emerging threats. We also work to include or integrate integrated pest management into the response continuum for invasive species. So if you think about preventing an invasive from getting into the United States, we don't really work so much in that area, although we do certainly acknowledge the importance of it. And early detection, rapid response is usually the purview of other agencies, agencies like APHIS or a variety of others. We work mostly through partnerships on developing programs to reestablish integrated pest management programs focused on established invasives. And so certainly grasses, some of the grasses that are affecting wildfire cycles here in the West is obviously one of those pest issues that at this point is no longer subject to eradication, not on a national scale, but certainly still can be on a local scale. But these are now pests that are here to stay, and so we have to develop programs to manage them. And we also work to publish reports, very much like the CAS manuscript we're talking about today. You can actually see the QR code for that on your screen, or you should be able to see it. And then every once in a while down below, there will also come a banner. There it is, pointing you in the direction of that publication, so you can download it when you would like. So as Greg mentioned, the center partnered with the Western Society of Weed Science to put on a workshop several years ago, which was focused on weeds and wildfires in the West. That workshop then led to a discussion about the generation of this manuscript, which is what we're talking about today. So if we think about wildfires in the Anthropocene, and I've heard this term used, I don't know if it's widely accepted, but I kind of like it because it highlights the impacts that humans have on the environment these days as being somewhat outsized compared to some of the other impacts. We can think of a variety of things that impact or cause wildfire cycles to change. Certainly climate and ignitions are important factors, but that's not what we're going to focus on today. Today, what we're really talking about is vegetation and fine fuels and ladder fuels and some of the things that wind up changing those wildfire regimes that are vegetation related. So the reason we think this is important, certainly, as I mentioned before, these plants are here to stay. No longer really, eradication is no longer really something that we consider a viable option. Certainly not at the national level. So the argument has been made that well, they're here to stay, and so we should just learn to live with them. And I don't totally disagree with that statement. However, it should be highlighted that by changing these wildfire cycles, we can significantly impact human and environmental health. We talk about this in the manuscript. So if you look at the image above, this is an image from the Canyon Fire in California, and it highlights two things. One, that's a wildfire, that's a wildland area right next to an urban area, and we refer to this as the wildland urban interface. There's a lot of it in the United States these days. And as fires spread through wildland areas and get closer and closer to urban areas, of course, that represents a significant risk for us in terms of structural damage and also loss of human life. And then the other thing you see pictured in that image is the smoke. Smoke, of course, can also have significant respiratory issues associated with it, and the plumes of smoke coming from some of these wildfires is significant. So clearly there can be an impact for us in terms of human health. And then in terms of environmental health, one of the things that the United States has that really there's almost no equivalent are some of the most iconic national parks in the world. We also have national forests, lots of places where people do a lot of recreating, which is really positive, good for their overall health. And, several of these parks have been closed for extended periods of time because of wildfires. Several of them have been altered significantly as a result of wildfires, and this impacts the ability to recreate in these areas. And so we feel like that's an important problem associated with some of these weeds. So because of the impacts of some of these weeds on human and environmental health, in the manuscript, we talk at length about some of the management opportunities to try and make sure that these weeds don't become more significant problems and actually try and limit their spread. One thing that Brian is going to talk about quite a bit is some of the mapping and prediction tools that allow us to better monitor the distribution of some of these plants. We've got new application technologies and herbicides that can be deployed for better control. We've got new rehabilitation approaches that we talk about. Actually, this is Jane Mangold who talks about this in the manuscript. So talks about some of these new strategies and techniques that can be used. And then, of course, there are a variety of other techniques. Virtual fencing and the use of grazing is one that we address in the manuscript. So that's kind of how the manuscript is structured. There's obviously a lot more detail there than what we're going to talk about today. Today, we're just going to talk about some highlights. And so Brian is going to talk a little bit about the efforts in Wyoming. So that's all I have. And I think, Brian, you're next.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate it. I want to commend both Matt and Greg for pulling this effort together. It's a lot of folks from all across the country that contributed to this publication. I spent some more time reading through the whole thing again last night, and I'd encourage you to take some time and read. There's some great case studies that are regionally specific. So thank you guys for all the efforts that you did to pull this together. As Greg said, I'm Brian Mealor. I have a couple different roles with the University of Wyoming. But my longest standing efforts have really been as a rangeland weed scientist. And Matt talked about this continuum of IPM, looking at the balance of challenges and opportunities depending on stage of invasion. I'm going to touch on that a little bit, but one of the things I wanted to start with is I was on a panel a few years ago that people kind of laughed when I got introduced as a rangeland weed scientist. I think they weren't sure what that meant. And one of the other folks on the panel actually said, I will describe what a weed scientist is. It's someone who focuses on vegetation ecology, but they don't just describe problems. They devise and deploy and evaluate solutions for those problems. And I think there are a number of issues that are clearly described in this manuscript and this publication that point out some of those problems, some of those issues. And one of the things that Matt just brought up is this proliferation of new tools and technologies. Probably more information and tools at our fingertips as land managers, as weed scientists, than we've ever had historically. And helping land managers and weed managers best use that information in a way to have the biggest impact from a management standpoint is really what a lot of us do at land grant institutions and other agencies and organizations around the West. And so I think this paper moves that forward a lot. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the impacts of invasive grasses in Western rangeland systems. I'm going to talk a little bit more about strategies and some of the tools that our team and our partnership at Imagine has been putting together. And I'm going to, if you'll indulge me, I'm going to start with a little bit of an ecological diagram to kind of set up some of this discussion. So we use this in many of our presentations and publications. If we look at our vertical axis where we have no desirable plants to high desirables at the top, and in this case, IAG, we're talking specifically about invasive annual grasses, low invasion to the left, high invasion to the right. We end up, when we combine these two things that I think about as invasion state and recovery potential, we have different opportunities and different levels of impact. So if we're in the upper left, we got all the good guys still in place and a really low level of invasion. And so in that IPM continuum, we're thinking about things like maintaining or preventing or implementing early detection and rapid response. And if we go down to the bottom right, we've likely crossed an ecological threshold with that invasion. In the case of something like invasive annual grasses and sagebrush systems, that conversion is likely facilitated by repeated disturbance, in many cases fire. And then in the middle here, we've got some level of invasion that is likely to have negative impacts, whether it be on ecosystem goods and services related to wildlife or grazing or plant diversity. But we still have sufficient desirable plants on that site where it's more of a weed management project than it is a full restoration project. And understanding where we are in this continuum, in this landscape, really allows weed managers to devise an appropriate strategy, to develop an appropriate level of response, whether it's monitor and wait for trigger points, or whether it's full-on restoration or changing in other practices such as grazing or active herbicide management of those weeds. We think about this a lot at the individual site level, but the reality is that as we look at a landscape scale, these different situations exist. And so understanding the fact that invasion proceeds across a landscape in sometimes a predictable manner, but also understanding that there are places that are still low invasion and high quality where recovery potential is high, changes our sense of urgency and might change the way that we prioritize our actions across the landscape. Now, the tough part about this is we go back, let's say 10, 15 years ago, we didn't have the tools necessarily that we have today that are freely available to weed managers or land managers, in many cases at the national level. And so you can choose from a giant menu of different products that are currently available, whether they be through one agency or another. I think about things like the Rangeland Analysis Platform or RC Map or other. You can choose your favorite tool that you like to use, but understanding how these different vegetation states exist in relation to one another across the landscape helps us devise a strategy and prioritize spatially. The other thing, and I will say that all of those different tools do an excellent job at encouraging users to also go out and continue to verify what they're seeing on the landscape with some traditional monitoring approaches. There's probably some middle ground there where it's impossible to have boots on the ground in every acre of millions of acres of landscape that you might be managing in your management unit. And then there's also some extrapolation that may have some uncertainty around it from strictly using satellite-based imagery products. And so one of the things we do that we try to do in our program is encourage people to find the way to integrate both of those to help develop their landscape context and devise a strategy specifically for invasive plant species in the Western landscape. This also coincides with a number of new tools from a management standpoint. Matt talked about that a little bit, whether it be things like virtual fencing, that we can better control grazing distribution across the landscape in a real-time manner, or whether it be some of the new herbicides that have come online in recent years that seem to be more promising in terms of long-term control for invasive annual grasses. This slide also reminds me that the pace of invasion, based on a number of different publications recently, actually seems to be increasing in the Western U.S. And that's happening even prior to a change in wildfire regime with invasive grasses. So we see those negative impacts even before the facilitated change in fire regime that may lead to more frequent and in some cases more intensive wildfires. Now, it's discussed in the publication that's not always a predictable relationship depending on where you are. As you move south and east, it may be the opposite, where the lack of fire or the reduction in fire actually leads to an increase in woody invasives. And so it's almost an inverse relationship as we move south and east, or as we move north and west, depending on the ecosystem that we're working in. So a group of us got together several years ago and said, hey, there's so much stuff that's going on. It's difficult even for those of us whose primary job is to keep up with new developments and new science. Let's try to figure out a way to support and empower land managers to really make sense of this, help them think strategically, provide them with support, not just information, but come alongside them, help them plan, help them devise strategies and implement those strategies, and understand the impacts of those strategies across the landscape. And that was the beginning of what we call Imagine in the state of Wyoming, Institute for Managing Annual Grasses and Invading Natural Ecosystems, and an early effort within Imagine was what we also call the Invasive Annual Grasses Tech Transfer Partnership. Here's a list of folks that are the primary partners, organizations that are primary partners in our Tech Transfer Partnership. And it really came from a realization of the shared need, of the urgency of this issue, both from a wildfire and associated impacts standpoint, but also from just the invasion and the impacts of annual grass invasion in Western landscape standpoint, and really providing that opportunity for land managers to do better and to feel confident in making some of these difficult decisions. And so we do a number of different things. We have an annual webinar that we just wrapped up back in April. We have a number of outreach materials that I'll show some examples of as well. And then we have what we call level 2 and level 3 workshops. We've got a level 2 workshop in Idaho Falls in June. If you're interested in attending that, it's part classroom based and part field based. Please visit invasivegrasses.com to find more information about that. And our level 2 workshops are really geared toward hands-on, place-based experiential learning in terms of how to devise and deploy strategy for improving annual grass management. And then what we call our level 3 workshops, we actually do facilitated working sessions with cooperative working groups around the West. And we've done those in 6 or 8 different states now for organizations that have been working together for decades, or new organizations that are trying to take a landscape scale approach for managing annual grasses. And we have a set of principles that we work through with those groups that I'll touch on in just a moment. I wanted to this is a little bit of a crazy diagram, but it really sort of is the underpinning of what our Tech Transfer Partnership is focused on. And I've got 2 external forces there at the top and the bottom, and these are just examples. These are not the only ones that we talk about, but this philosophy of defending and growing our core, which really It's not necessarily a new idea. It's maybe new marketing of things that we would think about in terms of the IPM continuum. And really, if we go back even to a different set of information, implementing the wildfire model of weed management that Steve Dewey discussed years ago in Utah. And that's don't just go to the worst places first and invest all your time and effort in those places that have already experienced significant degradation, but try to locate those sites that we can protect, that we can defend, and then use those as anchor points and build out from there. And I think that's something that many weed managers and weed scientists have implemented for a long time. And it's now sort of broadened out to the larger conservation community. And I think other folks are thinking along those lines in terms of defending and growing our core. I'd say that coincides with the publication of the Sagebrush Conservation Design in our part of the country that really identified the urgent need of active management of sagebrush grasslands in such a way that reduces the continued degradation of sagebrush grasslands of potentially over 1 million acres of loss per year, that hundreds of wildlife depend upon those grassland systems, and also communities and economies also directly relate and depend on those sagebrush grasslands. So it helped to take a big first swing at identifying areas of high integrity in rangelands across the Western U.S. And then we focus a little bit more at helping on-the-ground managers take concepts from these larger programs and then implement them on the ground, understanding opportunities for spatial prioritization, and then implementing appropriate management actions for those different situations across the landscape. Our team devised a set of principles. We were working toward prescriptive sort of recommendations and said, this is site specific, and it's also species dependent if we're talking beyond just things like cheatgrass. And those principles really revolve around understanding of team dynamics and cooperative resource management, and also with an ecological understanding of invasion and rangeland restoration. And so act proactively, which is really a principle of IPM, longstanding principle. Leverage ecology, so it's not just a weed management issue all the time. Understanding the way the system works and working within the ecology of that system to make the best decisions that we can, considering landscape context. And then really more the human side is we have to work together because it's larger than any one management jurisdiction, and realizing that it's not going to be a simple silver bullet and that we're going to have to stay committed over the long term. And I'll say we've just released 2 new episodes in our film series about defending your core from invasive annual grasses, where we're highlighting efforts from different working groups around the Western U.S. that are really implementing these principles in their areas. And so those can also be found at our website, invasivegrasses.com. We've got an excellent group of team members. I think about specific shout out to Mariah McIntosh, who's with the Intermountain West joint venture, who has worked diligently, and she's very talented with graphic design. And she's helped to put together educational materials like this that help us think through life cycles of annual grasses, and within a growing season, within the annual cycle of those plants, to help us determine which specific stage in the life cycle that we're trying to target with management, and then really provide some initial guidance on what types of control and associated management practices, such as grazing management, might be used appropriately at which time of year and at which stage of the life cycle. We also are working to provide some basic guidance on understanding some of the newer tools. This one specifically is how does Indaziflam control invasive annual grasses, as quick references so that land managers can access the information in a highly digested way to help them solve problems and make some of those plans. And then we've got additional information that they can dig further into. But this just allows people to get a better feel to address some of those questions that I think that may crop up today when we get to the question and answer session. And I think this is analogous in many ways to the goals that Cast and Greg and Matt and others had for this publication, is to provide a high-level overview of the issue and really initiate the discussion so that we can help landowners, land managers, and policymakers really understand how big of an issue it is and be equipped with sufficient information to move forward with their programs. I'll wrap up personally. Although I've been involved in rangeland restoration and weed science for 25 plus years now, I was super reluctant to get involved in the invasive grasses world. So many great scientists through the years that have been doing amazing work, some of whom are included as co-authors on this publication. It's a big issue. It's not just a rancher issue. It's not just a farmer issue. As both Matt and Greg pointed out, there are societal issues that are definitely impacted by millions of acres that have been shifted from highly productive, diverse, largely native dominated plant communities across the U.S., not just the Western U.S. And so I think it's a challenge for us to think about as a society. And it's also a privilege to be able to work and help landowners be able to think through these issues and to work with other great scientists on this. So I'm happy to try to address any questions. I will turn it back over so that we can get ready for question and answer. And I thank everyone for their attention today.
Okay. The first one that I would like to ask, I'd like probably Matt to address this. One of the things that surprised me early on was that as these invasive grasses got worse, that fire tolerant plants became, they were actually dying in some of these fires, where the plant is supposed to be fire tolerant, but the fires are so hot that it's killing fire tolerant plants. Would you like to address that, Matt?
Sure. So these systems, these ecosystems that we see in the certainly in the Western United States, but I would also argue you see it in the Southeastern United States, are adapted to fire. And so they are accustomed to burning routinely, but not at the frequency and the intensity that we're currently seeing today. And that has a big part of that is the type of fuels that are now on the landscape, which are vastly different than what we used to see. So for instance, if you think of the Southwestern United States, which is largely desert, it tends not to really burn at all because there's not really a lot of fuel on the ground for it to burn. And so the plants there are not really adapted to that kind of situation. And with the with the encroachment and widespread distribution of buffalo grass, we are now seeing basically a whole-scale change. And some of those iconic species like saguaro cactus that we normally identify with the Southwest are being impacted. And then the flip side, as Brian talked about, there are some fire adapted like the pineland savanna areas in the Southeast they are adapted to burn. And so you see some of these species coming in, which are then suppressing fire and changing that landscape as well, which then impacts people's ability to use. I don't know if you've ever tried marching through a thicket of Brazilian pepper tree, but it's not fun. So it really does impact the ability of people to recreate on some of these in some of these areas.
Okay. Thanks, Matt. So I've got in the news, we just had all these fires in Nebraska, and we got a question about that with regard to these Nebraska fires. What should growers do to get recovery, things like that? And are there some things that they should definitely avoid doing?
You want me to take a stab at that one to start with, Matt? Is that okay? I was actually over in Nebraska last week chatting with some folks about invasive grasses and the fire issue. Catastrophic historical fires that those poor folks experienced this year. Greg, the 2024 Eastern Wyoming, we had one of the highest wildfire years in history in Wyoming as well. And I think one of the things that we talk about a lot, and that I think is supported pretty well from the literature, is that one of the great determining factors for post-wildfire response is pre-wildfire vegetation condition. And so if you know that your plant community was in good shape before the fire, and if the fire was relatively low intensity, let's say a fast burning fire that moved through an area that was not super hot, you guys talked about the changing nature of the fuels, then the likelihood, if we get precipitation, is that we might see a good recovery of that existing vegetation prior to the fire. That was similar to prior to the fire. One of the challenges, Greg, that we have is that we don't always have a good feel for what the plant community was like before the fire, right? And so some of those tools that I had discussed, that I had briefly brought up in my comments, that allow people to look back at previous years for plant community descriptions based on remote sensing, gives people a pretty good starting point if they don't have on the ground monitoring data before the fire. The other thing that I think has been discussed pretty extensively is, and this is not a criticism in any way, I think it's a very natural response, is we got to get out there and do something immediately. And I think in some cases, a little bit of patience to see how that plant community is going to respond following a fire might allow you to devise an appropriate strategy for weed management to keep those plants, the plant communities, in the shape that you want. I think the worst thing we can do is assume that there's going to be a whole bunch of weeds that come up in an area, and we use a weed management approach that's not compatible with allowing the desirable plant community to recover following the fire, and we make it worse. And so if you look at a lot of the patterns across the data, immediately following a fire for a year or two or more, sometimes there's a lag before those the annual species, especially invasive annual grasses, really start to uptick. So I'm not saying don't be proactive, but sometimes we might want to just see what kind of response we're getting before we be super active with our management strategies.
Very good. So in cropland agriculture, actually, one of the best weed control tools out there is a healthy growing crop. How can we fit that into the rangeland systems and out west? You've got a lot more topography than we do farther east. How do we give that environment, that ecosystem, that colony, the ability to outcompete these weeds?
You want to take a stab at that one, Brian, or you want? Well, so just right up front, there's really no question about this. In terms of ecological processes that play a big role in shaping plant communities, competition is principle. And it's interesting because I don't think I'm trying to think of another example where we see competition as one of the things that we can really point to as a ecological factor in shaping the community. You know, I'm an entomologist by training. We talk about competition a lot, but we focus mostly on predation and parasitism as being factors. And I know for the vertebrate folks, they also principally focus on those. They don't talk. The competition, I think, plays more into the way they think about the way their structure, you know, the ecological structure shapes up. But in terms of plant community, competition is I think one of the more important, or possibly the most important factor in shaping the community. Now, as to how, you know, so we talk about this in the manuscript. It's really important, and that's why we use, you know, integrated weed management or integrated plant management. It's important to be able to shift that competitive balance to the species that you want. And there's a variety of ways in which you can do that. And again, this is addressed in the manuscript. Um, you know, you can use, there are a variety of tools available to you that you can use to shift that competitive balance. But what you really need to avoid, and what's really important to avoid, is that you don't wind up doing things that basically set you backwards on what you're trying to do. So you have to, it's really important, and that's why we talk a lot about this. Brian talked a lot about it in his talk too. You know, you've got to form these partnerships where you've got folks at the local levels that really understand the system and how it works, involved in the conversation about how you're going to manage these things at state and regional and even national levels. Because to be honest with you, those folks at the local level who see this stuff day in and day out, those practitioners that walk this ground routinely, have by far the best information about how that system works, and will be able to give you real feedback on what kind of strategies are likely to work best. So I don't have anything specific. Maybe Brian has more specific.
Matt, that was great. I think the only thing I might add is that sometimes we can love a place to death in a lot of ways. And I think active management and thoughtful management for how do you maintain desirable plant communities is really the key to what we would say defending your core, like identifying those high quality areas and continuing to manage them in an active way, whether it be grazing management or whether it be any number of things that you can consider that maintains a healthy plant community. Because Greg, I don't think the principle of competition, as Matt was saying, is different in rangeland systems. It's just more complicated.
Yep.
And especially as you move into those semi-arid areas where we have naturally a bunch of bare ground between our plants. I think that's one of the reasons why some of these cool season winter annuals get a foothold, is because there's some resources at a time of year that are not necessarily being used. They kind of start as passengers and they hijack the system and they become drivers later on. And so anything you can do to maintain a healthy, desirable plant community, I think is really our best long-term strategy. And it's probably not going to build a truly resistant plant community, but hopefully what it does is it limits the impacts once those invasive plants become introduced.
So I really like this question. The paper is pretty candid that revegetation more often results in failure than success. What is the single biggest reason revegetation efforts fail after wildfire, in your experience, on the ground?
Man, I can make a run at it. There's actually some really great long-term sort of meta-analyses that have been done on post-fire seeding. And honestly, if you look at the data, it's pretty bleak. I mean, and that's reflected in the paper that we're talking about today. And I I think, I mean, it's difficult. It's difficult to reestablish, especially some of our native perennial plants. That if you think about their recruitment pattern in nature, recruitment meaning establishing from seed a new population or continuing a population is there. Many of our long-lived perennial plants in rangelands have very episodic recruitment. So we might only get a good sagebrush recruitment year once every 20 or 25 years. And we're expecting those seedings to just work on command. It doesn't always work out that way. It's challenging because we could do everything right. And if we get precipitation at the wrong time, or we don't get sufficient precipitation, or our weed management strategies are not compatible with the reseeding. There's a tremendous body of research around improving plant materials to where they'll do better on these post-disturbance revegetation projects. And I think we're probably better at it now than we were historically. But we're also expecting more out of those projects than we were historically as well. I mean, I think about the millions of acres that were seeded to a monoculture of crested wheatgrass throughout the Western U.S. historically, which stabilized the sites. It provided some measure of forage and some measure of wildlife habitat, and actually are really quite good at preventing further invasion from some of our annuals. But when you compare what they provide as a plant community to a diverse native plant community, probably didn't hit the mark that we were looking for from a revegetation standpoint. So that's a great question. Matt, I don't know if you have anything to add, but I think those are probably the high sort of things that come to my mind.
Yeah, just one quick thing to add, and you mentioned it in your comments, Brian. Many of these species are episodic, so they don't act on command. It's not like planting fescue or some other grass that we know how it's going to respond, and it's going to respond the way we expect it to. So one of the things, and this is something that Jane talks about in the manuscript, and it's certainly something that I've seen too, you have to monitor for more than a year afterwards. And that's what we generally see is monitoring for a limited period of time after the revegetation event or activity. Some of these species are remarkably resilient, and I know that it paints kind of a dark picture, but if you read the manuscript, you'll find that actually there is a silver lining, and that is that these systems are remarkably resilient. You oftentimes don't have to tweak them a whole lot, and that's what Brian was talking about too, loving a place to death. It's not like you have to go in there with a big giant sledgehammer trying to beat the thing to death. Oftentimes just small little adjustments. And again, this is where people at the local level will be able to give you the most accurate information. Oftentimes is sufficient to get the results that you're hoping for, but it may not happen in your lifetime.
So we'll switch gears a little bit. What's one thing you wish policymakers understood about the issue that they currently don't understand?
You want to start on that one, Brian, or you? No. Okay. So, we go and we talk to, staff, representatives office staff routinely. And I think actually, Greg said it best at the Western Society of Weed Science meeting. Many people just don't realize the impact that some of these plants are having. And so you can kind of hear that in the comments, what they make back to us. It's like, well, the thing is established. It's not going anywhere. It's part of the landscape now. Why are we even worried about it? There's not much we can do. We heard this from Brad Little back at the Western Governors Association meeting, back in 2020. It's like, well, they're here to stay. Like, let's just get used to them and not worry about it. And I guess the thing that I would like policymakers to really understand is that's true. I don't disagree with that statement. However, there are significant impacts associated with these species in terms of ecological health and human health. And so it's not really a matter of just, well, we're just going to have to accept it. No, I don't think that's quite right. I do think that there are going to be situations where we need to step in and make management decisions to shift the balance back towards a system that is more predictable, more understandable, and also less, threatening, a lot less risk associated with those systems in terms of human and environmental health.
Man, I'm going to pile on there. I think that's great. I'm going to the one thing I'll add to that. I think is understanding that there are many places in which that's the case. There are also many places in which that's not the case. And so I think in some ways we've been super effective at getting the impact message across. But I think there are some people that make an assumption that, oh, you get west of the Mississippi and it's all completely degraded. And there's some fantastic large scale plant communities that are still left. And I think that's why understanding that landscape context and taking a strategic approach, instead of and you probably know this as well as anybody, Matt, is it seems like in many cases the dollars and the emphasis go to the worst places to try to fix them. And while we're focusing on those worst places, behind our back, the good places are degrading.
Yeah.
And so not focusing so bad on fixing the bad spots that we forget to keep the good spots good. I think that's maybe the message to refine it a little bit.
All right. So I need to get this one asked, and I'm going to try and shorten it up. Invasive is a really wonderful herbicide that is highly effective, and it's going to be used everywhere. How do we keep that from becoming resistant, or from the plants becoming resistant to it?
Yeah, leave it up to Bill Curran to ask a hard question like that. That's the kind of thing that keeps you awake at night. And I will say that there has already been documentation of some annual grasses. I think it was annual bluegrass in some turf seed production fields in the Pacific Northwest with Invasive. I mean, if you look at the profile of efficacy and exposure to multiple generations with a single application, I mean, it's scary. And so I think one of the common recommendations that our group kind of keeps landing on is having some tank mix partners, and for multiple reasons. There's data that we get more consistent control 1 year after application if we have a tank mix partner with some post-emergence activity. And so we get some benefit there. I mean, it's already expensive, but we got some good tools that are relatively cheap. And the data from a resistance management standpoint is that mixing modes of action might actually be better than rotating modes of action. And so I think that's one of the things, Bill, that folks are trying to do. And I also think it's using it in situations where it makes sense. Don't just automatically default to this one tool. There are other places where other tools still make more sense. And so I think it's all of those resistance management and prevention paradigms and strategies that we use, and we have talked about in other systems. But I'm glad that you bring it up, because sometimes I think people don't make eye contact with that question, and we absolutely need to keep it in mind.
Yeah, one thing to add, of course, is that those industries, certainly the pesticide companies, they need to be partners in all this. Most of them have stewardship programs, but we really need to, as part of our efforts, make sure that they are at the table when we're talking about some of these issues and how we're going to manage them. Because I feel like sometimes, we kind of consider them to be the bad guys. And I mean, you can argue that point whichever way you want to, but I think that if we give them the information that they need, I think their decisions will likely be better. Their stewardship programs, some are pretty good, some are probably less good. And I think to a large extent, it's a bit of a failure on our part to make sure that they understand kind of how those products are being deployed and what kind of feedback we're getting. And certainly more information that we can give to the more information we can give to them, the better their decisions are likely to be.
Okay. Last question would be, how do you convince a land manager to actually prioritize invasive weeds and when they're just worried about controlling fires?
Matt's staring. You want me to make a? You want me?
Well, I'll have to admit my sociology degree is non-existent. And convincing people, I can't even convince my kids to empty out the dishwasher some nights. So,
Yeah, Aaron, that's a great question. It's gonna be weird. I think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you're worried about personal safety and putting out a fire, you got to do that before you can think about improving your plant community. It's a balancing game. All this prioritization is. I mean, I think about we're not many landowners are not going to implement some kind of active management until they start to feel an impact from that invasion, and rightfully so. You start to pencil that stuff out. But then you think about it over the long term. If you start to realize those impacts in terms of forage production loss or loss of grazing flexibility or wildlife habitat that are moving off, it's difficult to balance out that once the impacts start, it's more difficult to get those systems back to a desirable state than it is to act early. And so I don't think we've got that one figured out yet. It's a great question, but I think once the fires are out, continue to encourage people to think long term and strategically instead of just tactically and short term. So it's a great question, Aaron. If you have an answer, if that was like a setup and you've got a great answer, please get in touch with me offline and let me know what that is.
so I have just one thing to add to that, and we do touch on that in the manuscript, and that is that, you know, all the things that we propose, all the things that we'd like to do, and Brian talked about this earlier too, you know, they have to be realistic. We know that there are a variety of priorities and there are limited resources, both time and money. And we have to take those realities into consideration as we develop our management plans and as we move forward. And like I said, Brian said this early on, you can love a place to death. And what that really means is that, you know, sometimes, you know, more of a hint, like wait and see kind of, I know that sounds like denial. I get it. And maybe it is in some cases. It's probably not as simple as this or that. But definitely, you know, sometimes just letting it sit and waiting to see what's going to happen might be the best option. So we certainly understand that resources are limited, and there's just no way that you're necessarily going to be able to achieve, you know, some sort of pristine situation like what it was once upon a time. We're not suggesting that in any way, shape, or form. What we're suggesting is basically a very pragmatic approach to the situation. And in some cases, you're just going to have to say, well, there's probably not a whole lot I can do in this case because I don't have the resources to manage this.
Okay, that's as much time as we have for questions. I thank all of the authors and the reviewers and everyone. I thank the Western IPM Center, Imagine. I thank you, audience, for your attention and your interest in this area. I thank CAST for this opportunity, the Western Society of Weed Science, and please stay involved with this issue. We need your help. We need all of your support. The weeds are winning, and we don't like that. And we can do a lot. So with that, thank you very, very much.